Let's make sure we are live streaming. That's yes then. Turn that down in case anyone has any questions there. Right, I'm going to start bringing people in.
Good.
Where am I hearing myself? Where am I hearing myself? Here we go. Hello, every person. We have a lot of people to get in today. It's fun. So we are recording, aren't we? We are now recording. Well, hello, everybody. You are on mute for the time being. You can unmute yourselves. I am going to be locking this room at 10 past, so people can't keep coming in and disrupting. We are streaming to YouTube, although my link didn't work, so I had to do it in a different way. Just going to have to put something onto YouTube under the event, since it did not work. Oh. Guys, please, in the chat, type where you are watching from this evening. Oh, bloody hell. York, well done, Keith Swan. That's where I'm from. Liverpool, London, Exeter, Berwick-upon-Tweed, Hampshire, Florida, that's Joe, Bolton, the Netherlands, Kingston-upon-Thames. Very good.
I can't see any of them, Matt.
It's just on the chat. Yeah, just on the chat thing.
It's completely blank.
Ah, is it because it must just be a direct message to me? That's why.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, we're just keeping you out of this, Alan, really. It's just our own secret group. No, so if it was Scotland as well. So yeah, so basically if people just message me questions. So guys, as Alan's going to be doing a presentation, first of all, going through like 3 different sections. If you have any questions throughout, just message them to me. Alan will be stopping in between each bit as well to take questions, and Brighton Marina, Bradley, on his boat. We will be stopping for questions, and then after his presentation, we'll be doing lots of Q&A where you can actually come on the camera, come on screen and talk about it as well. Okay. Got a lot of people in, just wait for a few more, and then we're going to lock the room, and we're going to get going. Just out of interest as well, just type in the box, what is it that you do? Are you a hypnotherapist? Are you a counselor? Are you thinking about becoming a therapist? Or do you just like psychology and trauma? My hobby is trauma therapist. Hypnotherapist. And IEMT practitioner, Alan. Therapist, life and business coach, graphic designer. psychotherapist, IEMT, social worker, psychotherapist, counselor, executive founder, therapeutic specialist working with children and trauma. Got some very interesting people in here today.
Mhm.
Okay. Psychotherapist, IEMT. Oh, hey, Nicola. Hypnobirthing, IEMT practitioner. Midwife and trauma. Interested in trauma. Guys, I will be putting links to Alun's website, to his book. Please do support your speakers. A few more people coming in, and then we are going to get off to the races. Well, not to the races, because you might get shot. Right, okay, right. Here we go. Here we go. See how we're doing on YouTube. So I'm just going to put onto YouTube that we're actually. So my YouTube thing actually broke. It said I had the incorrect parameters, which is wrong because I followed it exactly as I was told. They were lying to me. All right, no, it seems to be. Oh, here's the. Right, okay, just trying to get some people waiting on the YouTube channel, that's all. Okay. Okay, everybody, we're going to get going in 2 minutes. And one last question. What would you like to get out of being here today? So what would you like to get out of being in this conversation today? I like to call it a conversation because it is part presentation, but it's also a conversation with me, asking some questions, and just because I'm interested in stuff, and obviously with yourselves as well. So what would make it a really good experience for you guys today? A simple method to navigate trauma. More knowledge in regards to trauma to help clients. Insight, inspiration, and hope. Alun, do you provide hope and insight and inspiration?
I'll do my very best.
Okay. So maybe some quotes or some things there. Just believe in yourself, stuff like that. Oh, we've got people in the waiting room, have we? Yes, we do. Another tool to help. Deeper understanding of early childhood trauma and how it impacts us later in life. Learn how to talk to help people who have suffered trauma. Oh, some really good questions. And well, good questions, that's me. Some really good answers. The questions are easy. So guys, I'm going to be doing an interview pretty much every Wednesday now. We've got the next one lined up, which is in 2 weeks' time. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get one in next Wednesday, but in 2 weeks' time, we have a woman who does rapid transformational therapy, RTT. She's a trainer. Last time I thought the speaker was so interesting, I found in the Netherlands a hypnotherapist who teaches his method. Maybe tonight I'll find another. So, Magella. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Sorry. I did his training over the weekend. Yeah, it was really interesting, actually. So that was Stephen Blake, who does All Pain to Go. Okay, we are going to get going in 1 minute. A few final checks, and then we are ready to rumble, which is rumble, but with a sort of French accent of some kind. Do you know, I often forget I'm live, you know, going out to people. I just sort of talk to myself, and life just kind of works out okay that way. So just before, let me just see everybody who's here. Wow, look at all these people. Look at all these people. Hello, everyone. How are we all doing? We all gravy? Lots of new people, lots of returning people. That's all great. That was a Scottish accent this time. I never know what's going to come out. Okay, I'm going to lock the room now. The meeting is now locked. Okay, brilliant. Let me bring it back on to us. So I'm going to remove myself from this very shortly. So let me just go through a bit of housekeeping, and then I'm going to pass over to Alan. Okay, so we're recording. Okay, so the next event, I'll put it on at the end, but that again is called Cindy Galvin, and she's going to be talking about Bradley, you can't see chat. No, that's fine. The chat just goes to me. So if you have any questions, put them to me. They don't go publicly. They just go directly to me. So you can ask any sort of questions without being embarrassed or anything like that. Just send them directly to me, and I won't mention your name when I'm asking them either. I've got one space left for the IEMT training this month, which is the 29th and 30th of April. If you're interested, just drop me a message. And then the one after is going to be not the last weekend of May, because that's bank holiday, will be the weekend before that. So if you haven't been to one of these events before, basically, it's just a discussion around something. It's going to be part presentation, then it's going to be part Q&A, and then sort of more discussion kind of towards the end. We will finish definitely by 8:30. If not, it can just go on and on and on and on. So we will finish by 8:30, so don't worry. And yeah, basically, this isn't a sales event. Now, Alan does have some products and services, which we'll talk about at the end. And I'll also send out those links to you afterwards as well, along with the replay for today's event. So Alun Parry is the author of the acclaimed book, How to Remove Trauma Response, a memory reconsolidation guidebook for therapists and coaches. He is the founder of Fresh Therapists, and he teaches many therapists and coaches on how to remove trauma consistently. He's the director of the Liverpool psychotherapy practice, where he specializes in working with adults and who have childhoods that felt less than safe. So, Alan, over to you, sir.
Okay, welcome everyone. Good to be here. So, yeah, I'm going to share my screen because I like to scribble. It kind of slows me down a little bit, makes it a little bit easier for things to process for you as well. So yeah, this talk is called How to Remove Trauma Response. There are some free goodies that go with the book that even if you don't get the book are going to be quite useful to you, like a little bit of training, some downloads. So feel free to get that at removetrauma.com. If you did want to get the book, it's available on Amazon, which looks like this. So you'll see the big orange cover. So yeah, what I want to do first of all is, because this is called How to Remove Trauma Response, I just want to kind of define trauma as I'm meaning it in this talk, because there's lots of different definitions of it. And for me, I'm giving it a very wide definition. So for me, when I'm talking about trauma, I'm talking about the big T, I'm talking about the little t, however people might think of it, basically any psychological injury that still touches life today. So that's quite a wide definition. And I use that wide definition because it actually meets how the brain mechanism that we're going to be talking about tonight operates as well. It doesn't make a distinction between one kind of psychological injury or another. If there's something there that's still getting in the way of life today, this brain mechanism that we're going to look at called memory reconsolidation works with that either side of that spectrum, if that makes sense. In terms of the phrase response, like trauma response, what I'm talking about there are the bodily responses, the emotional responses, crucially the nervous system responses that kick in, the kind of meanings that we make of things, all these kind of responses that actually get in the way of life today. And I'm going to be splitting the talk into 3 sections, just so it's kind of nice and structured. In between each of these sections, I'm going to pause, and then any questions can come in. I'd rather pause because I don't want to kind of blunder on if there's something that just isn't clear. I'd rather you get clarity before we go on to the next section. So the first part that we're going to look at is how trauma response is actually stored anatomically, because we're going to be looking at something which is a biological brain mechanism. So we need to kind of understand how trauma response is stored physically, anatomically in the brain. So I'm going to go through that in a moment. The second part is I want to look at what I might think of as the removal model of change. And then finally, I want to give you the formula for trauma removal. And I call this a formula because this is essentially the steps that the brain needs in order to be able to trigger this biological mechanism that removes trauma. So I'm going to show you the exact steps that the brain needs, that it actually requires in order to make that happen. And you'll see that that's kind of like a roadmap, really, that you can use going forward for your own work, and also in terms of finding new methodologies that will give the brain what it wants. So let's start with this top one here, first of all, how trauma response is stored anatomically. So I'm going to be doing some drawing. I'm not the best drawer in the world, so please bear with me on that front. But essentially, when we have emotional learning, as you can maybe think of trauma-based learning that has come with a high level of emotion, what you have is a brain pathway. So this is something that's physical, just like the road outside is physical. You have a road network. You have something very similar in the brain. So you'll have a brain pathway that the trauma response is stored in. And then inside of that brain pathway, you've got all this kind of encoding, what I'd call the trauma response, the emotional responses, the bodily responses, essentially how the body should react if something in the now resembles back then. And when you've got emotional learning and it's stored in a physical brain pathway like this, the brain is pretty eager to keep hold of this trauma encoding because it's got a survival implication, basically. And so when now resembles then, the nervous system will pick up on the cue and this brain pathway will be called upon and these responses will then be played out. So for instance, a person who might see a particular color that's evocative of something traumatic might go into a panic attack because what's happened is the nervous system has picked up that there's a threat in that color and it plays out these trauma responses. But the key thing to remember here at this point is that it is actually physically, anatomically stored on something like a road within the brain. And the brain doesn't want to let that go because evolutionarily speaking, if you've learned about something dangerous, it wants you to remember about that dangerous thing. So the key question, I suppose, is this changeable? Is the contents of this brain pathway changeable? So for many years, the answer that came from neuroscience was no. So what neuroscience said is that the brain basically locks this pathway, throws away the key, and so you're kind of stuck with it. And there is no change in this. There is no way of getting rid of that trauma. If you've had the traumatic event, evolutionary speaking, your brain wants to keep hold of it, and it's hard lines, basically. So that was always the neuroscience position. Now, when that was the neuroscience position, it did actually have an implication for therapy itself. Because if you can't change this, how do we help people make life better? Well, the way that we make life better for people, if you can't change this, is accept that you're stuck with the traumatic response and instead try and nurture and strengthen and build a competitive brain pathway, one which has got the stuff on that you actually want to have on it. So let's make that a green color. And so through the therapy, you'll try and strengthen this pathway, you'll nurture it, you'll try and ensure that in a moment of stress, this is the one that gets chosen more than that one. But you are still stuck with the trauma. So the trauma remains intact because that's what we thought. Now, this is effective, and this did actually change people's lives, but it doesn't get rid of the trauma. And so in moments of high stress in particular, like any competition, no matter who's top of the league, for instance, they still get beat sometimes. The best tennis player in the world still gets beat sometimes. So in any competition, what can happen is that actually this trauma response can win. And what happens as a result of that is the client who's been doing really well up until that point then relapses back into the trauma response. And so they go back to square one and they feel stupid and they feel as though they failed. They feel as though they've done something wrong. And they haven't, of course. It's just that competitive therapy, the way I'm thinking of this, because it leaves the trauma intact, and many therapies continue to leave the trauma intact, that danger of relapse is always on the cards because the trauma is still there. So that's what we were stuck with the old neuroscience answer. You had the trauma, you can't get rid of it, so your best option is to compete with a better brain pathway. And this is where the client says, I'm at a crossroads and now I find myself taking the better path. However, there's been a breakthrough. Happened just over a quarter of a century ago. And there were a series of neuroscience experiments. And what they showed is that the old understanding was incorrect. And that actually a brain pathway that is contained in the trauma response can actually be overwritten. So you remember before we had this whole other rigmarole of nurturing a different brain pathway. Well, the implication of this neuroscience finding is that we don't need to do that. We can actually just get rid of it. So the trauma is then gone. So what it's more like is it's more like a combination safe. So that's my combination safe, by the way. So what the neuroscience has said is, evolutionary speaking, the brain wants to hold on to this, so it's not going to let it go and you can't change it. What we know now is, the brain wants to keep hold of it, just like a combination safe wants to keep hold of your valuables. It does want to keep hold of it. But the difference is that if you know the code, if you know the particular specific steps, you can actually open up that combination safe. You can open up that brain pathway and you can change its contents. Now, there's a lot in any sort of science where there'll be an experiment and it's done once and they try it again and it doesn't replicate. This has been replicated over 30 times. So this is as robust as you can really come up with. So this gives us another option then as therapists, as coaches, that instead of competition, we can have removal. And when you have removal, what happens is relapse becomes impossible because the trauma is taken away. It's very much like recording over an old cassette tape. Let's say you have a cassette tape. It's got a band on that you don't particularly like. You can't stand the album. So you overwrite it. You record over with a band that you do like. Going forward, there's nothing else you really need to do. You don't have to keep on doing things to the cassette tape in order to keep the old album at bay. You've just got a new album now and it's straightforward. And it's exactly the same in terms of when the trauma response is removed through this process of memory reconsolidation. From the client's point of view, they no longer need to keep doing a whole host of exercises. They no longer need to keep the trauma at bay because it's been overwritten. For the client, once the change has happened, the maintenance of the change is effortless. And it's permanent because it's been overwritten, much like the audio cassette that I mentioned. Now, the mechanism that does this is a brain mechanism, which is called memory reconsolidation. So all parts of our bodies in our biology have mechanisms. You know, if you shine a light in my eye, it's going to change the size of my pupils, for instance. And the brain has mechanisms too. So this is something that we all have. Every client, if you like, steps into our office or our Zoom room with an innate trauma removal mechanism. That's what memory reconsolidation is. The brain comes equipped with a mechanism that it innately knows how to do trauma removal. There are certain steps that it needs in order to make it happen, because it does want to hold on to emotional learning quite tightly. But nonetheless, this is the mechanism by which that can be overwritten. Now, there's something particularly interesting about memory reconsolidation, in that it is the only known brain mechanism that does that job. It's the only known brain mechanism that removes or overwrites trauma. And there's an implication in that as well, which means that if any client has, or any person has gone through that process where their trauma response is gone, that it's effortless to maintain, it's as if they never had it, that tells us that memory reconsolidation must have happened, because it's the only brain mechanism that can do that. So whatever modality that you use that gets those kind of results, any kind of inadvertent way that has gotten those kind of results, it must have triggered memory reconsolidation, because that is the only mechanism that does that. And so the question for therapists then is basically, are you still going to do competitive therapy of the kind we looked at here, keeping the trauma intact? Or are you going to do erasure therapy, which removes the trauma for good? So let's just summarize on that first part then. In terms of how trauma's response is stored anatomically, it's physically held in a physical pathway. We thought we were stuck with it until about a quarter of a century ago. Now we know it's more like a combination safe. And as long as you know the steps, which is what I'm going to tell you at the third stage here, as long as you know the steps, then you can actually trigger the brain's natural mechanism for getting rid of that trauma completely. So I'm going to pause there just in case any questions have come in, because I know I'm going quite quick with this stuff. So I'll let you process it a moment before I move on to the next stage of things.
Okay, so if anybody has any questions, just type them into the chat box for now, before we move on any further. I've got one here, actually.
Yeah.
With the competitive side, would that be more like a CBT-based approach?
Well, potentially, but one of the things I'm going to get across to you tonight, and now's a good place to do it, depending on whether you meet the steps of memory reconsolidation or whether you don't. So basically, if you meet the steps of memory reconsolidation, then what would happen is that you would trigger memory reconsolidation, and that's erasure. The trauma is gone. And if you don't meet the steps, then it follows that you're doing competitive therapy.
Okay.
And keeping the trauma intact. Now, the reason why I put it in that way, because it's a little bit less about the model maybe than what the therapist actually does. So it's conceivable that a CBT therapist could do some of the work of CBT and then ensure that they meet the steps, in which case they could actually trigger erasure.
Okay.
It's also conceivable that a CBT person is just doing this and not meeting the steps. So one of the things I often say to therapists basically is that you could actually keep the modality that you're working in, but you might well decide to tweak it. What we're going to see in the final stage is exactly what those steps are.
Okay.
So let's say, for instance, I'm going to give you a map, essentially. Let's say this is my friend's house. And let's say this is my friend's front door. If I were to visit my friend and I wanted to end up here at his front door, then I'm going to have to go into his street. I'm going to have to walk up his path in order to end up at the front door. Like, these are non-negotiable, these steps.
Okay.
But how I actually get there is very much up for grabs. And I'll come back to this later. I could cycle, I could walk, I could get the bus. I could get the bus and then do a bit of walking. I could get the tram. I could get a scooter. You know, there's a whole host of different ways, as we might think of it, different modalities by which we might lead the client to the point where we're then ready to give the brain what it needs to meet the steps of memory reconsolidation. And there's only 2 of them, but I'll save it for you a little bit later on. So yeah, it could well be that CBT delivers competitive therapy, but it also could be that CBT a practitioner could actually meet the steps of memory reconsolidation. And by the same token, there are certain therapies whereby they're consistent with the steps of memory reconsolidation.
Right.
And at the same time, the therapist could still miss the steps, even though the modality is kind of pulling them in that direction. I often think of it this way. Let's say you've got 2 bus drivers. And if you look kind of closely at what the bus driver's doing, you'll see that they're steering the wheel, they're changing gear, they're putting the brakes on, they're putting the accelerator on. Their modality looks the same. And yet one would be taking you to London and another one could be taking you to Aberdeen. So that's kind of the analogy that I'd use with that. One of the wonderful things about memory reconsolidation, because it's not about modalities, it's about giving your brain what it needs. It means that many, many different modalities can successfully trigger memory reconsolidation. And so our job as therapists, I think, is to understand the map much more so than the modality, because there are modalities out there which offer great resources that you can even tweak once you understand the map of memory reconsolidation. And that's what I'll give you in the final block there.
We've just got a few more. We've got quite a few messages in regards to EMDR, basically. Is the EMDR the eraser? Is the EMDR focused on, basically, is the EMDR... so I think you just said it then. Basically, there's a number of ways, isn't there? So EMDR is not, it's like very similar to IEMT. It's not necessarily the only thing that causes consolidation, but it is one of the methods, I suppose.
Yeah, I'd say there is no only way. And this is the wonderful thing. I've been in sessions with clients, and in the dance between myself and the client and what they're happy with and what they're not happy with and what kind of needs have emerged in the moment, have been able to improvise things. In fact, the method inside of the book, like if you go into the book, there is a method in there. But I'm always at pains to say that it's only a method. But I built that from the ground up. It's very, very effective. But I basically started with the map, like what does the brain need, and then developed the methodology to meet that. EMDR is consistent with the steps that the brain needs to trigger memory reconsolidation.
Perfect.
So when it's done well, it should get that result.
Just got a couple more, if that's okay. Then we'll get pressing on.
Yeah.
One was, can you work on trauma that has no memory? So I presume that's somebody who experiences the symptoms of trauma, but doesn't necessarily have, an identifiable memory, initial sensitizing event, I should imagine, or PTSD-based memory that's actually causing it.
Yeah, I believe you can. So can you come back to me with that question? Because once I've actually shown you the map, I'll be able to go into more detail as to how that would work.
Okay.
So the short answer now is yes, but the longer answer, the more detailed answer, I'll apply that to the map a little bit later on.
Okay.
And you'll understand why even somebody without a clear picture of, say, their origin story, or the imprint menu as a memory, as you might call it, can still actually work with this stuff.
Perfect. We do have a couple more. I'm going to save them because they're a bit more general. So I'll pass back over to you. Then I'll keep these till the end. But those people that have messaged me, I will ask them later on. Okay.
Okay. Well, we'll have another little break in a moment anyway. So if they feel appropriate there, then feel free to throw them in. I'm happy for the questions. Some of them will be better answered a little bit later on as they're coming in. But they're great questions that have come in so far. So thanks. Okay, so let's move on to we've done this first part about how it's stored anatomically. What I want to get into here is what I would think of as the removal model of change. Because the way I see this, one of the implications of understanding that trauma is stored in a brain pathway like this and can be changed, one of the implications is that our problems make sense. So the way I see that is that these are not pathologies, they're not irrational, they're not disordered, they have a pro-survival function, they make sense. And so no matter how unusual something may seem when it's presented, I think our stance as therapists is best if we look at it as, this makes sense, so let's figure out how. Because when we figure out how that it makes sense, then we basically found the trauma response, and then we're in a position to overwrite it. So there's a thing that I often say inside my coaching academy, and it's a bit of a daft phrase, but I'll share it with you anyway. All change is easy, except when it isn't. Now, what do I mean by that? Because it's a bit stupid, isn't it? But essentially, our clients make change all the time. So, for instance, I'm thirsty. I want a drink of water over here, and I go and get the drink of water. I'm sat in the dark. I'm trying to read my book. I really need some light in the room. I go and put the light on. All change is easy, and our clients, I'm tired. I want to go and have a sleep. I go and have a sleep. So change is happening all the time in the lives of ourselves and the lives of our clients, and it's easy. And the reason why it's easy is that when we go to do the thing, there's nothing that gets in our way to block us. What happens, though, in terms of trauma response is that when we go and get the change that we want, something gets in the way. And what that often shows up as is some sort of autonomic nervous system. Not if they say that trauma is felt in the body, the autonomic nervous system kicks in and makes us feel uncomfortable about proceeding with the change. So let me just try this with something like social anxiety so I can give you a real world issue. Let's say you've got a client. This is a diagram I use quite a lot. So this is the client, and they've got this problem. They're isolated, they're lonely, they feel anxious in social situations, say. And they know what they want, especially once we've helped them kind of crystallize it. They want to be, they want to be with people. They want to be going to those events that they get invited to. They want to be walking up to people at the party and mingling and, initiating conversations. That's how they want to be. And of course, that's true. So why isn't this change as easy as many of the other changes they have in life? Well, if you drop them into an imaginal experience, like just be that person now, you've gone to the party and you can see that there's there's like a group of 3 people, you know, they seem like interesting people. And just imagine yourself walking towards those people to confidently say, you know, hi, I'm such and such, and striking up a conversation. And what happens is that this block kicks in, this aversive bodily response. And it's a nervous system response that is spotting danger. So the way I conceptualize this, and people within my coaching academy will know this well, is I refer to this as the invisible twin. In other words, the client comes into the room and they really do want to get rid of this problem. And they really do want this outcome. It's absolutely genuinely true. But what happens is that this invisible twin kicks in. These bodily discomforts happen that are kind of aversive and try and stop them from moving forward. Because what's basically happening here is there is a trauma response, an emotional learning, if you like, that basically says the price that you'll pay for this change is going to bring you greater suffering than the problem that you've already got. And so it becomes emotionally necessary to keep the problem. The client is saying, I want that. But their trauma response, their nervous system, their invisible twin is saying, you might want that sunshine, but I can see a huge threat to that. So a big part of our work is to try and discover what this trauma prediction is. Now, I see the nervous system activation as a prediction. It's predicting that there is some sort of threat. The brain is essentially a predictive machine. It's always trying to figure out what's going to happen next. If the brain was reactive, we would faint every single time we stood up. But instead, the brain is figuring out what we need and thinking, oh, Al's clenching particular muscles here. That tells me that he's probably going to stand up. I'm going to put some blood to his head. So by the time he is stood up, he's not going to fall down again. And in the same way, when the nervous system responds, it's because it has a prediction of unsafety. And if you really were unsafe, well, thank goodness that your nervous system is already pumping your heart and sending blood to the muscles so you can bump the lion on the face or run away. So these bodily discomforts are essentially a trauma prediction of unsafety. And so our job, I see it as, is to try and discover what that is so it can be overwritten, so it can be updated, so we can use the brain's mechanism of memory consolidation to update the prediction, and this invisible twin stands down. Because if the invisible twin stands down and that's not there anymore, then it's going to be very, very easy just to go and get the thing. There won't be this aversive trauma response that's stopping them from getting the thing. So our job is to find out together what the trauma prediction is and focus on being able to remove, to update that nervous system trauma response so that the nervous system does what it's meant to do, which is operate in the here and now in order to scan for danger and react if there is any here and now danger. Once we get rid of this, once again, change becomes easy. It's a straightforward, I don't want to be in the house isolated, I want to go to the party. And in that process, in that journey, nothing anymore stands in the way. So I call that the removal model of change, because it's not about trying to force the outcome. It's about getting the nervous system response to stand down because we're updating that prediction through memory reconsolidation. So I think I'm going to pause again and just leave room for some more questions there. But essentially what I'm saying here is that what the nervous system is basically doing when it stops our clients from making change is saying there is a price that will come with this change, and that price is too big. I'm going to give you an example actually before questions. So this is the thing I said a moment ago, the social anxiety. So I'm isolated, don't want to be isolated, don't want to be anxious. I actually want to be out making friends and meeting people and so on. And yet when they imagine themselves walking up to the group of people to start making friends, the nervous system screams, stop. The invisible twin, our job is to bring that invisible twin into visibility by finding out what this discovery is. And it's often phrased in a kind of an if-then, like, if I let myself, talk confidently, whatever it is they describe that they want, and approach people and share things about me. So we're kind of digging into this invisible twin here. Then I'll be mocked and ridiculed. Maybe say, just like Dad used to do. Anytime I was visible with Dad, he would mock and ridicule me. And so now, in the here and now, whenever I go into a situation that could deliver that, the invisible twin, the nervous system is like, no, we're not letting you pay that price again. And aversively pulls you back, just as if you were walking towards the edge of a cliff. It spots the danger and it pulls us back. And so once we know what this trauma prediction is, we can then take the next step, which is to give the brain what it needs to trigger memory reconsolidation so that it's no longer there. And I really will stop now. So let's hear any questions that you've got so far.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. This in the IEMT model, basically we call this like an imprint in action. Right. So basically something which you want to do, but you're stopping yourself in a self-sabotage way, I suppose. It's and what I find is with people, just because something may have happened, like your example there, like what Dad used to do, that might be 20, 30, 40 years ago. And people think, well, it can't be something that happened so long ago because it doesn't make sense. But that trauma was encoded at that age, and it stays, at that age until it's updated. And so what I find
is
that
still in the combination safe, and according to the nervous system, that's still a threat. That's why it remembers it. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And from what I understand is that negative memories are clearer and recalled and brought up more predominantly is because they are there to keep you safe.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why with IEMT, we look at these, like I say, these imprints to try and, again, reprocess, break them down. And so basically, it's just when the client thinks about doing something, it does begin to remove the resistance, minimizes the actual resistance of doing so. Okay, I've got lots of, what if you allowed yourself to be mocked and ridiculed, so to exercise the invisible part, even if it's scary? So from what I understand here, this is kind of like face your fears, face your fear and do it anyway, or something like that. So basically, I suppose this is what essentially exposure therapy rather than reconsolidation. Basically, if you allow yourself to be mocked and ridiculed, now that can go very wrong, I can imagine. But what's your stance on if you don't work with this, it's your twin, I believe you called it, and you just actually put yourself through the trauma instead?
Very similar to what I said a moment ago. So something like exposure therapy. That could be counteracted. That could be competitive therapy.
Yeah.
Or it could be erasure therapy. And it's going to depend again. So I'll come back to this kind of question like the other one after the next bit where I show you the map. Because what you could be doing there is keeping the trauma response, but strengthening another brain pathway. And so life may improve as you start to choose this one rather than the trauma one, but it's still there. So it could have that end result, depending on whether you give the brain what it needs. Or if you do give the brain what it needs, then it could actually result in this again. So the modality is probably less important than what it is that you're doing. So it could certainly be the case, and it'll make more sense in a moment, that somebody starts to generate what you might call mismatching evidence.
Right.
And so they might be like, if I'm rocked, there might be another prediction after this, if I'm mocked and ridiculed, I will be devastated and it will be catastrophic, because as a 6-year-old it was. But they might actually get into tune with other resources and think, well, yeah, it was like that now, but it wouldn't be like that. Well, it was like that then, but it wouldn't be like that now because I've got all these other resources. And they might actually feel that being mocked and ridiculed wouldn't be quite so devastating. They might not, but they could get to that point. But I think it really does depend on whether the brain gets what it requires, just like the combination safe needs what it requires in order to open up and let you change the contents. Because if you're not doing that, you may well just be, and I'll talk more about how you can miss memory reconsolidation and simply just be doing competitive therapy, because there's a certain amount of joining the dots that in exposure therapy you would have to do in order to make it erasure-based.
I've actually seen this go horrifically wrong on a number of occasions when it comes to public speaking and social anxiety, where they try to push themselves through, sometimes using, I don't want to mock Tony Robbins, but that kind of therapy where, you go make your move. And I've seen it go horribly wrong. And now what that client has, they have all the rubbish from the past, plus this recent experience. So that means next time it's even worse.
Yeah, and this is the thing. So when I drew this little diagram before, so there's the person with the problem, and they genuinely do want to make this change. Sometimes therapists get impatient with clients and say, oh, they're not properly invested. I think they are, because they're showing up and often they're paying money. It's this character here, which is almost like an embodiment of the nervous system. And so the way I would think of it is like the Tony Robbins way, as you said. It's kind of like eyes on the prize, power through, force yourself past the invisible twin, go past the resistance. But instead, I think what's a better approach is to think not so much focused on the problem. It's helpful to know the desired outcome, but not powering on to try and force the desired outcome. So it's not about, I'm less interested in what the problem is, but more interested in the good sense reason why it's so necessary for them to keep hold of it.
Interesting.
And typically, the good sense reason why they keep hold of it is because the price that they would pay is too high, that there is a prediction of unsafety that says, I'm not prepared to let you pay that high price. When we update that prediction into the here and now by overwriting the trauma response, they'll see that price for what it actually is. And usually that price is much, much smaller. In which case it becomes easy because it's no longer threatening. So my focus is always here, not there, and not there. Because, like I say, the removal model of change means that once this invisible twin evaporates and no longer feels a need to intervene to keep the client safe, and this can be emotionally safe, existentially safe, or whatever, then the change is just going to be easy. There's nothing to power through. It's going to be as straightforward as someone who doesn't have a traumatic response around doing that thing. Like some people don't have a traumatic response around public speaking, and so it's easy for them. Those people who do, then you need to work with that twin. So find out what the prediction is, find out how it makes sense, because once you understand the prediction, it allows you then to move on to the next step, which is to give the brain what it needs to rewrite it.
Brilliant. I'll just finish with one last thing. There's some questions, but I'll ask them later. They're more suited then.
Okay.
Is that when I find when I work with clients, when they want to do this thing, and as you put it, this invisible twin appears and it stops them, it causes an awful lot of frustration because they know logically they can do it and they want it, but emotionally they're held back. And so what tends to happen, this big question comes up of what's wrong with me?
Right.
So why can't I do it? I should be able to go do this thing, speak to that person, do that interview. Logically, I know I can, but they have all this self-talk and all these emotions, anxiety and bodily responses. And it does, and when I say to people, well, it's caused because you've learned this, usually when you were quite young. And when we work on those things, you'll be able to do it without all the resistance. But yeah, but I often get this question of what's wrong with me, and why can't my logic trump my emotionality as well? This is quite an interesting one. So why can't logic trump emotion?
Because the job of your nervous system is to keep you alive.
Yeah.
The fact that you're here now means that it's been very successful so far, and it's not prepared to drop that strategy. The answer to the question of what's wrong with me is actually completely the opposite. This invisible twin response is genius, and it's normally genius that has been played out at a time when the person who developed it was very, very young. Sometimes people are coming up with these responses to navigate something that was very scary, only a couple of years after they could fully talk.
Yeah.
So this is very much a case of what's right with me. Like if that client goes back and takes away the invisible twin, but puts themselves back in the situation in which it was formed, they will realize that the consequences for them would have been pretty devastating.
Yeah.
That it's so much better that their invisible twin figured out, you know what, I best just stay invisible in this case. I best keep away from everyone and stay invisible. Because imagine if it hadn't. Imagine if they kept on being, criticized, mocked by dad every time. So this was a protective thing. And it's still a protective thing. It's still something that is a defense against danger. The only thing that needs to change here, if it needs to change at all, because of course, sometimes the invisible twin is the one with the wisdom. And I'll give an example of that if you want.
Yeah, please.
But the only thing is that it's just got an old prediction. So this is genius. Thank goodness that you developed this. And now it's getting in your way so we can update the prediction. An example, by the way, which is why when I'm working, I don't take a stance on behalf of, so this is the client, say, and this is their invisible twin, and I don't take a stance between the two. So I've had a case in the past where somebody is like, well, what I really want to do, I'm procrastinating, I'm not doing my work, and what I really want to do is I want to be doing my university work. That's what I want to be doing. But every time I go and do the university work, I feel this discomfort, this invisible twin steps in. When we did the discovery, the invisible twin is saying, yeah, but you don't want to be a doctor. You wanted to study English literature. And so in this case, it's saying, you're only studying this because your father made you do it. You don't want to be doing this. So there's a certain amount of wisdom that the invisible twin was having. Now, what's the right result there? I'm quite constructivist, so I wouldn't impose one. But maybe the right result is, yeah, the invisible twin's right. Sod this. I'm going to get my poetry books out. I'm going to change my course and do what I want to do instead of following someone else's plan for my life. So the invisible twin can sometimes, is always bringing wisdom. A lot of the time, what we're looking is for the invisible twin's prediction to stand down. But there are occasions where the reason why the invisible twin is stepping in is because it's got some useful information. And that useful information might be that this isn't your plan. This is you obeying. And I don't want you to obey, so I'm stepping in because I know you want to be doing something different. And then that's something else to kind of bring into the room there. But typically it's this kind of thing, and it's an act of genius.
Brilliant. Excellent. So we've got a couple of questions, but we'll leave them to a little bit later. Let's do the last bit and then we can open it up to everyone, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Cool. So, fantastic stuff.
What I'm going to get to now is the roadmap. Like, what's the formula for trauma response removal? Now, this formula, I think, is more important than modalities. So what happens when you're a therapist, and I'm sure you've all been on this journey, I certainly have. You start off with the modality that you're trained in. You're out there in the world, you're seeing clients, it's going well, and then you'll start working with the client and your modality just doesn't help them. And so you go and learn something else, And then that starts working well. And lo and behold, you're going to then meet someone else and start working with them. And that doesn't fit with them. And then you'll get on the therapy forums and you'll get the whole word salad of, oh, you need to learn ART or EMDR or, whatever it happens to be. And then you're on this treadmill of constantly trying to learn new modalities. And the problem with that is, one, it's exhaustive and expensive, but also as well, there's so much that you have to learn when you learn a new modality. And a lot of that stuff is kind of extraneous, I find. And a lot of that stuff that you're learning is the therapy's own theory of why they think it's getting the good results that it's getting. But like we said before, memory reconsolidation is the only brain mechanism that generates that level of transformational change, which is permanent and effortless for the client to maintain. And so the real reason why any of these things work is because they give the brain what it needs to trigger memory reconsolidation, just like a torch in your eyes gives the eye what it needs to change the pupil size. So I'm going to give you the map of this, but just before I do, I want to make clear what we mean by memory in memory reconsolidation. Does this mean, for instance, that a client no longer remembers their abuse or no longer remembers the traumatic event? Are we imposing amnesia onto a person? Well, we're not, because memory reconsolidation doesn't work on story memory. It only works on implicit memory. So implicit memory is the kind of autopilot limbic system stuff. So our emotional responses, the meaning we gave to the event, the nervous system responses, particularly conditioned associations, like someone might say, if anyone puts their hand on my shoulder, I get a shiver down my spine because it reminds me of my abuser. That's a conditioned association. So the implicit memory holds all of this stuff, and memory reconsolidation updates that. What it doesn't do is update the story memory. And the brain actually plays fast and loose with story memories anyway, which is why if you read a biography from a famous person, they recount a celebrity conversation from 10 years ago, you can pretty much guarantee it's mostly fiction, because we find it difficult to understand the story part of things and remember that. But the implicit memory, the stuff which is around survival, it keeps hold of that. So the reason why I'm telling you this is the end result of memory reconsolidation is that the client remembers what happened to them, but it no longer has that distressing response that is going to now get in the way of life if they try to do something which would in the past have felt similar. So how do we help them do this? So let's give you the formula. The formula is really, really straightforward. So it's not always easy to actually do, but let me show you the formula. This is what the brain needs. And without this, you don't get memory reconsolidation. I'll break down the kind of anatomical bits for you in a moment. It's basically activate plus mismatch plus repeat. So I'm going to go into what we're activating and what a mismatch basically is. So what you're essentially doing here is that trauma prediction that we saw earlier on, which was shown in the body, the nervous system response. We try and put language on the nervous system response by getting to know the invisible twin in the way that I work. Well, there'll be different ways of doing it in terms of other modalities, but you're basically reconnecting with that activation. And the reason why the brain wants you to do this is so it knows what brain pathway we're working with. If you think of getting a spreadsheet out and you just start typing, it's going to go in some haphazard cell of the spreadsheet. But if you want that information in a particular cell, you click it first to activate it. And then the computer knows which cell to put the new information in. And that's what's happening here. So you start off by activating the old distress, the old trauma prediction, the old emotional learning, however you want to phrase that. And then what we'll do is we will create some sort of mismatch experience, which could be conversational, could be using the imagination, as I tend to do, could be experiential. It could be something that you go out into the world and do some sort of real life experiment. But nonetheless, you follow the activation pretty much immediately. So it's almost simultaneous with a mismatch experience. And then, like one of my coaching academy people has a lovely phrase for these as each of these are bumper cars. And then what you do, you bump the bumper cars together in order to repeat that mismatch, in order to repeat that disconfirmation. So a mismatch experience is something which genuinely lands and disconfirms the trauma prediction that's being activated. So let me just talk you through the way this works anatomically. So let's say there's an activation. So it's activated. On its own, that just runs the contents of the brain pathway, but it doesn't do anything in terms of change. By the same token, if there was just, say, do you know how sometimes in therapy rooms there are nice experiences? Nice experiences which maybe would be an opposite to the trauma prediction, like maybe a nice visualization or something like that. Then all that is a nice experience. In fact, what you're doing there is building a competitive pathway because there's been no activation in advance. But when you do an activation and a mismatching experience in close quarters, what happens here is that the safe opens up, the brain pathway unlocks and is ready for rewrite. But it's only ready for rewrite. It's like the door has swung open of the safe. The thing that actually completes the rewrite, and this is the crucial part, is when you repeat the bumping up together. So it's almost like this gets the brain to kind of, be a little bit surprised. My expectation here has been mismatched. What's this about? And it's the repetition that completes it. So you can see as a therapist, there's lots and lots of different ways in which you can discover what the trauma prediction is or connect to the activation. There's lots and lots of different ways within your modality where you might provide an experience that mismatches that. And yet, even if you have those ingredients, you could miss memory reconsolidation. You might just do the mismatching nice experience. That won't bring about the kind of memory reconsolidation transformational change. The client may be activated and on its own, it will do nothing. You might even generate some sort of mismatch experience that follows an activation that really gets that penny drop moment, and the client is kind of, seeing things in a new light already, but then you don't repeat it. And all you've done then is open the door and then nothing happens. The door stays open, by the way, for 4 to 5 hours. And 4 to 5 hours later, bang, it shuts again. And there's been no change. So this is the roadmap that we have to follow. So when we're looking at activation and mismatch, the key question is, so what do we activate? And that's basically the trauma prediction, the trauma expectation, how they see the world, how their body is responding to the world, what's basically going on for them. It often shows up with distress signals, but even if they're small, and it doesn't have to be a big activation either. A small activation is fine. And often you'll go for a small activation, especially if someone's got a low window of tolerance.
That's just to
yes.
clarify something here.
Of course, yeah.
So when you are activating this, are you getting them to think about a future time, or are you trying to uncover the imprint from them?
Okay, good question. It could be either. Typically, what you're doing is you're asking them, let's say, for instance, a client, let's think of something. Let's go back to the social anxiety one again. There's a number of ways that you can activate here. There might be a memory of dad mocking me. One of the things I often ask people to do is come up with like a movie scene. If this really was a movie of your life and this struggle was the story of the movie, what would be the scene that the director would show? A bit like Batman at the start where he sees his parents murdered, for instance. That would kind of explain your current struggle. So the audience would go, that makes sense. So there might be a movie scene that goes back and says, yeah, I see dad mocking me. And that might trigger the activation. It might be something that happened recently. So this goes back to someone's question a moment ago. Like, what if they don't have a memory of it? Well, that's okay, because the great thing about this is that life activates. If life wasn't activating this stuff, they wouldn't be coming to us for help in the first place. So there's going to be something that is happening, that has happened recently, where this problem has shown up. Another way is you can actually go into the future, have them imaginally connect to that scene that I was taking them through before. You're at the party, you're moving, and then you're moving towards the person, you're about to mingle, you're about to open a conversation, and that's going to activate that nervous system response. So that would work as well. So there's a number of different ways, and sometimes, it just shows up in the room. As you broach a topic, you might just notice that there's something going on with the client. Or especially if you've if you put some explicit language, which I like to do, like an if-then statement, to kind of connect to that. That can activate as well. Like, just connect to that young version of you, or connect to that sense that should you go over and speak to these people, they're going to mock and ridicule you. Just connect to that discomfort and that expectation. And that's enough. And of course, like I say, it only has to be a light activation. There's nothing that the brain wants. The brain is just getting you to click on the cell. You don't have to click really hard on the mouse. So the brain just needs to know what brain pathway we're working on, so it knows to replace this one rather than stick it somewhere else. That's why the activation is important. So you don't have to take someone into hell in order to activate. So any of these things, and the big clue is that there'll be some bodily response.
And would it work, for example, say that you have a client who's scared of flying, and for some reason you're with the client and you're on the plane at the time, would it work in real time as well? Or would the brain need the time to do the consolidation so it would work for the next time?
Theoretically, it could. I just wonder whether the client would be really flooded. That if they're on the plane.
Yeah.
Like, I suppose what I'm thinking is the great thing about working with the imagination is it's got a direct line to the nervous system.
Yeah.
This is why, for instance, you'll wake up after a nightmare with your heart pounding, and all you've had is your own imagination for company.
Yeah.
So what I find is, both with the activation and with the mismatch experiences, I use the imagination an awful lot. You can do it conversationally, you can do it in other ways. So I think theoretically you could take someone on a plane if they were scared of flying, but I imagine that their nervous system response would be so strong that it might be more difficult. And my thinking would be, well, why take them on a plane when you can do that imaginally? Just drop into the experience and just imagine you're on the plane now, what's coming up. And you don't have to leave them there for long. It's a light activation is sufficient. And so the moment that the activation is there, that's enough. But often it is just, what tends to happen in my experience is, once you understand the invisible twin and what it's guarding against, you can connect to that in a very empathetic way.
Right.
So just go back to that little girl, for instance, who was so worried about being told off by mum, was so worried about how volatile mum was. Just connect with her for a moment. And what's coming up for you at the moment? And the moment that they give you any sort of nervous system response, autonomic nervous system response, that's enough.
Brilliant. I just want to add a little thing there. I was talking to somebody recently who does about phobias, and they say when they do sort of activation, what they're looking for is the first time, the last time, the worst time, and a future time.
Yeah, all of them are all of them are going to be activating, and you would maybe choose different ones depending on the tolerance. And you can do this conversationally, by the way. So in the book, there's a story of a young woman called Vicky. She would never, ever reach out to her friends when things were going bad because she had a belief that nobody ever cares about her anyway. It was a belief that when you dig into her history, it makes sense because that's what she learned during childhood. And so even though she had a support network, she couldn't bear to be kicked further by having the rejection that she expected because nobody cares about her anyway. Now, just in passing, in one of our sessions, she mentioned that she'd had a difficult week. She'd had to go to the hospital and she was in the accident and emergency room overnight. And her friend was there, accompanied her. And so I was able to ask, what was your friend doing there? Because she'd been there for about 12 hours. I said, does she enjoy accident and emergency rooms? She's like, no, she was just there to care for me. So there you've got a mismatch thing. And so you can use that. So I was able to say, what's that like for you if you drop into that thing that's always felt true for you? So you're dropping into the emotional truth. That's the activation. That sense that nobody cares for you. And at the same time, just go to that in your mind's eye, go to that experience of being in the accident and emergency room with your friend, knowing that she's only there because she cared for you. What's that like for you? Now, I'm not playing a barrister role here. I'm just presenting the activation and the mismatch together in a conversational form, trying to make it as experiential as possible. And she had that kind of looking away light bulb moment. And we could see there that she started to be confused by that. She said, well, and you basically just repeat the question. Yeah, I can see that that's confusing because for so long this has felt true. And yet in this moment, this recent experience, she was there only because. What's it like? And so you can actually use the kind of whole bumper cars thing in a conversational sense as well. What I tend to do is I use imagination a lot more than that, but these opportunities do come up and you can use them.
And can I ask, with the mismatch experience, do you do one mismatch and repeat that, or a variety of mismatches and to create more confusion? So like, I don't know, say for example, they activate the emotion, the memory, the response, and then listen to music or go for a run or talk or do something like that. Or do you just get them to do one thing and do it over and over again?
Yeah, it depends on the approach that you use, really. So for instance, things like the rewind technique are basically repeating the same kind of visualization over and over again. Things like flash techniques in EMDR, they're using that sense of, you go to the distressing thing, you get the thing which is got positive effect, and you keep on cycling, swinging between them. Something like ideal parent figure, which is something I tweaked actually, because ideal parent figure was a positive experience, but this is kind of an ideal attachment figure that meets developmental needs. And actually meeting developmental needs, I think, is a massive mismatch for a lot of our clients. And so there, in ideal parent, you'll go to the young you with these feelings that are present at the moment, and then you might have a scene of safety. And then you'll come back just reconnect. So you activate, mismatch, activate, and this time it might be that you're really seen and heard. And you're layering on in this sense. You've still got the safety, but now you're seen and heard. You come back here, just reconnect with yourself. Hopefully this is beginning to change the bodily responses. And then you might have a thing of, being ideally reassured and so on. And the way I tend to do it a lot, and this is the stuff that's in the book, the model I use is an imaginal reenactment. So they'll take a scene. We'll look to find out what were the old feelings, what are the opposite feelings that they want instead. And then the client will come up with a scene that's reimagined entirely in their favor, that is designed specifically to give them those opposite feelings. And that's a good mismatch, because what's happening is it starts as it did. The horrible thing happened, like the autonomic spark, as I called it, where the world turns upside down. So for instance, I'm in the playground, I'm eating my sandwiches, I'm reading my book, I'm having a really nice time. And then the bully comes and grabs my lapels. So we keep that, and that's the activation. And everything after that is reimagined in the client's favor. And they get opposite feelings to the ones that the nervous system expects from them getting when the bully arrives. So there's a whole host of different ways of doing this. EMDR will have their ways. And I'm curious as well for those who actually do use IEMT, because I'm not an IEMT practitioner, if you can actually see this kind of roadmap in place, this sense of activation followed by some kind of mismatch experience. And then those two things are bumped up against each other. I don't know whether that fits.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically with IEMT, we can work on a direct experience or direct memory, or we can use an emotion which the person's experiencing now.
Yes.
And you can get that by a number of ways. Basically, just some people have a feeling of guilt, or when they think about a trigger, or they think about an anticipated event going for that interview, exactly, they will get a feeling. And then what we do with IEMT, we do basically a regression to the imprint. And so we go back to the first time they can remember feeling this way. And that's when we then move the eyes. So we get to the activation, and then the mismatch essentially is moving the eyes. And we don't exactly know what happens at the moment, but we believe it deconsolidates and reconsolidates the memory. And basically the result is the client moves further away from the experience. It becomes, I think it becomes, you're saying, I think it goes from like episodic to semantic or something like that. Mm-hmm. So basically you come out of the memory, you can see it from what it was, you see it from an adult perspective, right, and the emotion drops to basically zero, and it basically no longer affects you. And then when they go and do that thing, they're then creating new memory around that experience, and then they take that forward to the next time and the next time and the next time.
Yeah, so you're describing there an activation and then a mismatch of that, which ends up with the client who wanted this but previously had this invisible twin. Mm-hmm. The invisible twin's gone, and so bang, easy. Yeah.
And also with this process as well, you actually understand why you feel the way that you do. Mm-hmm. And that's very cathartic in itself, just realizing, because they would have never have matched those, because they're always trying to think of it within the context. To say it's social anxiety or going on a date, they're always trying to think about that, but they don't realize it goes back usually to things that happen at school or with parents, but they would never have found that link.
Yeah. And that's a key point, really. So the way I think of the work is sort of three experiential opposites. So can I draw that out just in case it's helpful? So the first one, the client comes with a problem, which I always like to enrich because it gives us some good information for when we verify whether it's worked later on, because those specific situations where the problem shows up, they should be playing out differently once it's worked. So I go from problem and then try and get the desired outcome. And then from that desired outcome, like if you were to move to that, I'm looking for the stop. So desired outcome, I'm looking then for the trauma prediction, the invisible twin prediction, like what's its function? Why is it stepping in? What's it trying to protect you from? What's it trying to keep you from? And then once we've got the prediction, we're looking to activate it and mismatch. And of course, in brackets, repeat. And so the work always follows this map. And like within the coaching academy, I give a map out that's very similar to this within the trauma removal club as well. So we're always going from this point where the first stage of the work is to find out what it is they want, because that helps us to understand why they're not getting it. It gives us a platform for this second part where we understand the trauma prediction that's blocking that, which will make sense. And thirdly, once we know the prediction, and knowing the prediction is helpful because it's very hard to provide a mismatch to something where you don't know what the relevant prediction is. So a person could think, all dogs fit in a handbag, and you might show them a Great Dane. But that's not a relevant prediction. It has nothing to do with the trauma. It's not the reason why the problem is being kept alive. But once you know that prediction, once you've identified that together, this is what we call discovery work. Then you can activate it, have them connect to it, and provide some sort of mismatch experience that lands for them. And once you do that, and it's repeated, this juxtaposition, what you find is that that invisible twin has stood down, it's gone, the trauma response is over. For that particular thing that you've worked on, you might work on a few things over your time together, but that trauma response is over. And as you just described, it doesn't show up again.
Oh, that's brilliant. And IEMT works in a very similar type of way. Absolutely fascinating.
So you can see there, Matt, can't you, that what's important really is what is giving the brain what it needs. If you give the brain what it needs, this means that many, many modalities can flourish. Many modalities can be tweaked. So we don't have to tell people they're doing the wrong form of therapy, or this is the right form of therapy, or this is the only form of therapy. And also, like I'm thinking of a member of the coaching academy had a situation where time was running out in the room. They were trying one particular approach, but because time was running out and because they had the map in mind of what the brain needed of activate and mismatch and repeat, they completely improvised this wonderful hybrid thing in the room. And they were able to have that kind of therapeutic skill simply because they were able to just place themselves onto the map of what the brain needed, knowing that if the brain got that, it would then trigger memory reconsolidation. And if the brain doesn't get that, then you're in the same place, or you're just doing competitive therapy. Are there any final questions, by the way? Because I know we're coming up to 8:30 and I could talk about this all night, really, but I was
going to say, time has absolutely flown by. We do have a couple of questions. I just want to ask, because you have mentioned your coaching academy and because you do your club as well.
Yeah.
Could you just explain a little bit about the difference? Because I'm just going to put the link up for your Fresh Therapist, because it's really, I don't like to use the word cheap. I think I'll use the word inexpensive.
Yeah, affordable. I wanted to do
affordable. Yeah.
There we go. So the Trauma Removal Club is really designed for people who might have found the book, or they might have found me online or something, and they might be very experienced therapists or coaches, but they might be relatively new to memory reconsolidation. And so what that allows them to do is it's $6.99 a month. So there's training in there. There's like a core curriculum in there, which will teach you about memory reconsolidation more deeply, and will give you some methods in terms of how to apply that yourself. And there's some downloads, and there's some bonus material in there as well that is basically going to help you start applying and implementing this And then the other thing is the coaching academy. It's called the Memory Reconsolidation Elite Coaching Academy. And that is for those people who know they're going to be a fast learner. So kind of know they'll get through this material and jump in, or someone who has been in the trauma removal club and is now ready for the next stage. So this has coaching as well. So there's live Q&A every month. There's a deep dive training every month. So this is where you're ready for more strategies, more techniques. So you're going beyond the technique that's in the book, and we're looking at a whole host of other things. And we have kind of case conferences where people will bring their actual cases, and they're 2 hours each time. We do that twice a month. And even that's affordable, actually, because that's £49 a month. And both of them have their own ongoing coaching forum. So in between the live calls, which actually some people prefer to watch the recordings of, there's a coaching forum where you can kind of, give your thoughts and stuff like that and seek help on an ongoing basis. So that's the difference. One is kind of, you're relatively new to memory reconsolidation, and so I don't want to blind you with science and overwhelm you too much. And this is where you're ready to kind of scope out and really get some mastery over it and start to use additional tools and techniques and understand how and why they work.
Brilliant. So I've put the links there. So the freshTherapist.com/join. That's the one. It's $6.99 a month, and that's the best place to start.
Yeah, in fact, that's the only one that's open. So this one, the doors are closed. The only way you can kind of get past the doors closed is by joining the Trauma Removal Club. This only opens once a year. If you join the Trauma Removal Club, you'll get like 48 hours to kind of sneak in the back door, if you like. But that's the place to join. And then you would either wait for the doors to open, or if you know you're a fast learner, you might just dive in, basically.
Okay.
And when you get this one, you get the Trauma Removal Club as well for this price, if that makes sense.
Okay. So the freshTherapist.com/join, and that's $6.99 a month, and that's cancel any time, isn't it?
Yeah. Anytime.
And that's just loads more resources. Well, that sounds incredibly affordable and great value. And obviously you do have the book. I will send the links out to the book as well.
Well, if you go to removetrauma.com, you'll find links there.
Yeah,
and you can get the goodies whether you buy the book or not.
That's very good.
By the way, if anyone's on Kindle Unlimited, you can get the book on Kindle Unlimited for free. I don't know whether anyone's on that or not. I know there are some trials going and stuff as well. So you might even sign up to a trial and get the Kindle version for free, because I wanted spreading wide the message of this. So I decided to put that on Kindle Unlimited as well.
I was going to say, you seem to be very generous with your resources and time, and trying to, it's not like you're selling a massive product or a massive training. You seem to be quite focused on just kind of like myself with IEMT and stuff like this. It's just kind of getting people involved with.
Well, the weird thing is, I found out about memory reconsolidation completely by accident. It was almost like the last thing that somebody said to me in a conversation. A new therapist came to the local area where I am in Liverpool and wanted to kind of connect with local therapists. I had a Zoom call with her, and it was almost the last thing she said, almost as an afterthought. And it's been completely transformative for my clients. It's been completely transformative for the way I work. And I thought, wow, I if we'd have ended that conversation 2 minutes earlier, I wouldn't have known about this. But it's so powerful that people shouldn't be finding out by accident. And so that's why I've written the book, and that's why I've set up the coaching groups that I've done as well, because I want people to know about it, because when you know about it, your clients are going to get these transformations as well.
Brilliant. And I think it's like, I only found out about IEMT because I went to go visit somebody who lived in Brighton, and he says, do you want to come and see this guy who does this thing about eyes and memory and stuff? And I was like, yeah. And that was it. If not, I'd still, because I was doing hypnotherapy, I probably never have found out about IEMT until now. Or maybe not. Guys, does anybody have a question and they want to come on and actually ask this? We have a quick question here. Is this only used in adult therapy?
No, it can be used. A child's brain works the same way. In fact, other animals, even down to things like, they've done experiments with shellfish even, and they have memory reconsolidation as well. So I think it's just our birthright, really. So for instance, the rewind technique, which I mentioned before, I know that there are human givens therapists and rewind technique therapists who work with children. So their brain works the same way, basically. I don't work with children myself. I work with adults who've had difficult childhoods. I sometimes wonder with children, and sometimes this happens with adult clients as well, sometimes they're not out of the danger. So it can be difficult to turn the nervous system off when the nervous system in the here and now is needed. But yeah, so let's say, for instance, someone had a bad experience of being assaulted or had a bad experience with a teacher or something like that. Their minds, their brains rather, have the same biological mechanism. They also have memory reconsolidation. And I did actually do a rewind technique session with a child because I was asked to, and I wanted to help. It's not the clientele I normally work with, and it was successful. And rewind technique only works because it follows the steps of memory reconsolidation. It activates and then mismatches. So the short answer is yes, but I'm not skilled in that clientele, if that makes sense. But the same questions that come up while you are working with that clientele, they'll be around memory reconsolidation and how it works. So, feel free to reach out and I'll help if I can.
Brilliant. Thank you. Any other questions, or does anybody want to come on to the actual call and ask a question? So just raise your hand. I'm not sure how you do that, to be honest. I'm sure you can. Does anybody have any other questions? Because if you're not going to draw this to a close, because we have gone very late tonight, but it's been absolutely fascinating. Again, so many parallels with IEMT as well. Does anybody have a question, or forever hold your... Anybody? I think they're all reconsolidating memories. So do we have one? We actually did have...
Has there been anything that I've not answered that you asked earlier on, and I said I'll answer that a little bit later?
There was one if the client doesn't have the memory.
Right. Can I just answer that very briefly?
Yeah, absolutely.
Then? So if a client doesn't have a memory, in fact, it's funny you asked that, because when I was training, I had this kind of thought experiment of an amnesiac client who had problems in the here and now, but didn't know where they'd come from. So it kind of mirrors that. So let's say there's a trauma response. It's stored in a pathway. And maybe there's an event or series of events. And it was written here. What we're looking for is an activation of this brain pathway, followed by a mismatch experience. We don't need to go back to the origin in order to activate it. What will happen is that life is going to activate it anyway. The reason why they're in therapy is because this is a problem. This is getting in the way. When they try to do such and such a thing, this plays out. And so what we can actually do is just go with what is in the here and now. There might be something where it played out last week. My manager sent me an email and I got this old response. Well, they mightn't even know it's an old response, but this thing that often happens to me with authority figures, it just played out. And it turned out that when I went to see them, as they'd asked me to, everything was fine. But for about 4 hours, I was pig sick. So you can use that. You can use anything which is an activation. The brain is not wanting you to necessarily go back. You can go back, but all the brain wants you to do is to play out, it's to connect with, is to activate this brain pathway where the trauma response is. There's actually a form of therapy that was developed by a Swedish psychiatrist called Göran Hoberg, which we cover inside the academy. And his is all present stuff. There is an aspect of it where you can optionally go back, actually, but in the main, he's working with what happened in the last week or so. And And as long as that recent event activates this thing that they want to work with, then that's all well and good. You can activate it and provide a mismatch experience. And the other thing I'd say about this is I view a trauma response as a trauma-based prediction. Predictions show up in the now and are about the future. So as a result, the past is optional. Clients sometimes like to go back there because it feels empowering, or they feel as though there's some learning there, or that's where it comes from. But ultimately, these predictions of, if I let myself think good things about myself, or if I let myself mingle with people, these show up right now. And because they're predictions, they're about the future. And so the past is an optional thing. And so if someone doesn't want to go there, or they can't remember, that's okay. As long as you're activating whatever the issue is that is showing up for them in present day life, you can follow that with a mismatch experience. You can do discovery in terms of what prediction is showing up for them in the moment. And you can still get to memory reconsolidation by following the same roadmap. Does that answer that question?
I believe it does. And I've got one here.
Yeah.
Saying, is it possible to do this on your own? And can you give some more examples of the mismatch experiences?
Okay. So let me just make a little note. So examples of the mismatch here. Can you do this on your own? You can. Yeah. So it doesn't say, for instance, activate plus mismatch plus a therapist with a particular set of qualifications. So the brain doesn't need that bit. We just help the process along. So you can do it on your own. I think it's a little bit harder to do on your own because you happen to be both the facilitator and you're having to be the client. But that aside, you can find a technique that works for you. And as long as you're activating in a way which looks after yourself, so you're not triggering yourself too much, and you're providing some sort of mismatch, then yeah, you can do that on your own as well. And of course, always remember to repeat to swing between the two. So it's a little bit harder just because you're playing both roles.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can. In terms of examples of mismatch, let's have a think. Okay. This is something I talk about a lot as well. It's a little acronym I use called bum fight. It doesn't quite spell bum fight because the GHT isn't part of it, but it helps me remember. It's like a little Rolodex. These are the kind of things you can mismatch. I'm just noticing Keith's hand is up, so I'll come to you in a sec, Keith. So things like the belief, the prediction, the meaning, these are all things that can be mismatched. Unmet needs is something that I go to an awful lot. And the ideal parent figure is a good way of doing that. But also, things like internal family systems and feelings is another. And like you were saying before, Matt, emotions. And one of the things that I do is basically, my protocol basically mismatches the feelings, that you reimagine the situation in order to get these opposite emotions. And then there's images as well and imagery. So things like the rewind technique will use imagery and stuff. So these are the kind of sources of mismatch. In terms of the techniques of mismatch, there's just so many of them. So there's conversational ones, like the one with Vicky earlier on. There's real life experiences. So you might decide to do a little bit of an experiment, for instance, and see how it goes. You might notice something has happened, which clearly, like with Vicky's case, clearly contradicts Self-contradictory statements sometimes is another one. Like a client will say, oh, the problem with me is I'm not very good with people. Well, I say that. And they start to contradict themselves mid-sentence. And I'll swoop on that because there's a mismatch there. I've actually done a whole session on something similar to that. The other thing is, you can use ego states. You can use parts work. You can use chair work in order to imaginally. There's just so many ways in which you can generate mismatches. You can do mismatches around fear versus safety. And I particularly like imaginal reenactment as a way of doing it. Does that answer the question in terms of various ways of examples of mismatch?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, no, it's very interesting. Very interesting. Cool. I'm going to bring Keith on because he has a question. If you could just stop the share for now.
I was about to,
And I'll just bring him on. So Keith, if you just unmute yourself and then you can ask your question and then we're going to start summing up, okay?
Hi, Alan.
Hiya.
I'm in your neck of the woods.
Cool.
It was me that asked a question about no memory.
Right.
For me, it's about this mismatch business. I guess a mismatch has to land.
Yes, absolutely. It can't just be a mismatch. It has to be a mismatch experience, and that means it lands. If it's conversational, there's a number of ways which you can see that it lands. It's like that penny drop moment. Some people will laugh. Some people will really kind of space out for a moment and look into the distance, but you can tell that something has connected. I'll just normally let that play out for a little bit until they return to me. So yeah, if it's conversational, it'll be that way. If it's experiential, it's to the extent that they're in the experience and it's evocative enough to provide these different feelings.
Okay, it's just in my experience, there tends to be like a tendency to dismiss.
From the therapist or from the client?
No, from the client. So you may be pointing towards, it may be coming up, it may almost be obvious.
Yeah.
But it isn't landing.
Yeah.
So mismatch, you say it as though it's easy to do. And in my experience, that's not necessarily so.
Well, it's funny you should say that, Keith, because like one of the people I'd recommend you look out for, who was really the pioneer who had one foot in the science world and one foot in the therapy world, is a guy called Bruce Ecker. And he's quite hard to read, I'd say, but he's still worth reading. And one of the things that when I've seen him practice is he uses conversation a lot more than I do. And so he seems particularly skilled at doing conversational mismatches. So like the one I mentioned with Vicky.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not that skilled at doing conversational mismatches. They do happen sometimes, and I'll have people sit with it.
Mm-hmm.
But I find that it's far easier
mm-hmm.
to do experiential work.
Mm-hmm.
That almost, I don't know whether it's just because with a conversation, everything above the neck is still present. And I think
I wonder if conversational is almost Ericksonian in a way. You know, it can be getting into that territory.
I think the more experiential you are with both the discovery work and the mismatch experience, the better. I've definitely had it where conversation has worked. But for me, and it might just be my style of practice. Somebody else might be watching this thinking, well, I find the conversational stuff really easy. And that's good too, because it works either way. I find that I don't get as many hits on the conversational stuff than I do when we drop into the experience. And so that's kind of one of my sort of little checklists of whether it's been a good session, whether people have been able to make contact with the experiential. because I find that they learn more when they connect to the experiential. There's a woman called Lisa Swartz who does something called the comprehensive resource model. And she has a lovely way of saying it, like, ask your body, not your brain. And I think there's something to that. So my experience is very similar to yours, but I wanted to throw the conversational in there as well, because if you're really good at setting up these conversations, then they can absolutely land. What I find is easier is if you transform the conversation. Say you've got an evidential mismatch. Well, one thing, Keith, is you might see it as a mismatch, but they might not. They might have some sort of frame of reference by which it's not a mismatch at all. You know, they might say—
That's the point. There's so many things that, it could be that, or it's just shrugged off as so what? Or, you know, and it's like, I've got one person in mind that, you know, it's really trying to find that way through. Whether we're doing the conversation or whether we're doing the experiential, whether we're doing, you know.
I think the most important part of the work, like all of our focus tonight has been on the fact that you can do memory reconsolidation, the fact that we've got this trauma removal machine in our own brains as a birthright, the fact that there's a formula that's quite a simple formula for us to follow. In truth, the big part of the work still is discovery work, of really being able to, for the client to really nail what it is that's keeping their problem alive. What makes this, you know, how does this make sense, basically? Because once you get that, the mismatches are easier. You can drop into experiential stuff. They know where it's coming from, or they know where it's showing up. They know what feelings it's evoking, what meaning is connected to it as well. And once you kind of nail that, the rest of it becomes a lot easier. But I have a similar thing to you. The conversation is more difficult. But I think the discovery work takes more time and is the chunk of the work that we tend to do. And then when we've got the discovery, the mismatch stuff, especially when you go imaginal, I think is like the thing in the book has been the most thorough way of developing mismatches, because it talks about bodily sensations, it mismatches emotions, it mismatches this thing that I call felt sense, which is essentially meaning. So I can ask them how they feel, like sad, happy, angry. I can ask them how their body is feeling, like butterflies in the tummy or their heart racing. But I also ask them about felt sense as well. And that means words which are neither of those things, but I feel unloved, I feel unimportant, I feel trapped. These are like the meaning that they assigned to the situation. So it mismatches that as well. And the other thing it does is I ask them to get in touch with trapped impulses, things that they really wanted to say, but they couldn't, or they might have been physically restrained. So there was trapped impulses so that they can be given life to in the reimagining. So that seems quite a thorough way of doing it, because you've got the bodily sensations from the nervous system, you've got the emotional responses, you've got the meaning, and then you've got any sort of trapped impulses as well. But yeah, conversational it doesn't land as often for me. I'll try it sometimes and I'll notice that they shrug it off. And okay, we'll try another one, or we'll just carry on with the imaginal stuff. But the discovery work makes the mismatch easier, I think.
I was also going to say, without going on too much about it, though, the exploring the safety that the invisible twin brings, and therefore the reluctance to actually give this up as well.
Well, that's exactly it. Yeah. And if you think of it in parts work, you can break down the invisible twin and start connecting with who that's protecting, and what would it be like for that young part of you if that just suddenly show up for work. And then you'll get a connection to this stuff. It's good discovery work there as well. And that's absolutely it. That's why the forcing through it doesn't particularly work anywhere near as well as having some sort of sense of, well, I need this, and getting to the point where they no longer need it, because that trauma prediction of unsafety is updated through the mismatch.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'll certainly check your website out.
Okay, well, nice to talk to you, Keith.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me just remove the spotlight. We are going to have to bring it to a close, unfortunately, because we've gone on for nearly 2 hours. Alan, thank you so much, guys. I'm going to send out the links shortly after this. Please join me in just thanking Alan for his basically for everything he shared with us tonight. It's been brilliant. I have asked people to unmute themselves. If you do want to unmute yourselves, you want to come and say thank you. If you want to type anything in 1 second with the chat, I'll do it to everybody. There we go. I'm going to be sent, like I say, I'll be sending this out very, very soon. It'll be probably this evening. And we have another talk in 2 weeks' time, all about rapid transformational therapy. But I will send Alan's stuff out. Please do check out his book, check out his websites. And thank you very much, everybody. It's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much.
I was just going to say, when you listen to the rapid transformational therapy, keep the map in mind and just see if it's ticking the boxes. Yeah,
I think it definitely will do. It definitely will do. Thank you very much, guys. If you
Thanks,
want to
everyone.
bye.
Thank
you.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Cool. What a great event. Here we are. Well, we'll see you all soon, guys. I'm going to stop this on YouTube.